I pretty much every Easter say that if you were to pick one Sunday to come, this is the one to come. I said to Barb just before we fell asleep last night, it's still my favorite Sunday of the year. I don't know about anybody else, but for me it is. And for a couple of reasons. I mean, that was a great drama. I got to see it in rehearsal. I was just looking forward to it. And the music's terrific. But you know the thing that I like? Is that Easter proclamation. Nancy led it. Christ is risen, and we respond, He is risen indeed. I had 2 funerals this week on Wednesday, both of them on Wednesday. And at both of those funeral services, and a couple folks were here for some, or at those services, I said that we would be saying this today. And people have not gathered for 2,000 years to say the stock market has risen. It has risen indeed. Or my RRSP has risen. It has risen indeed. Or General Motors has risen. It has risen indeed. Good as those things might be, here's the one hope that's held human beings in every continent culture for now 2 millennia. In the face of difficult times, of poverty, of illness, of hardship, of death itself, Christ has risen, and people have been responding for years. He has risen indeed. So I want to emphasize that little word, indeed. Why do we say He's risen indeed? Well, I don't know how many of you read the newspapers, but Thursday, in the editorial page of the Niagara Falls Review, they were carrying an article by Tom Harper. And Harper essentially said that the resurrection of Jesus wasn't something that actually happened historically. Ken Gallinger, a former United Church minister who ran for moderator a couple of times, now is retired, has left the church, writes in the Toronto Star. He's their ethicist, their ethical writing column. He said in yesterday's Toronto Star that he doesn't believe any of that either anymore. And for those guys, if I can sort of summarize, they might not put it exactly this way, but I'm pretty close, that the resurrection's more of a metaphor. The idea being that after Jesus died, His disciples, they were sad, but His teaching inspired them, gave them some hope. They were moved by His Spirit. So it was kind of like He was still alive in their memories. And over time, the idea of the resurrection evolved as a symbol. That idea says, as a friend of mine when I used to live in New Brunswick said, when you die, it's pfft. That's what he said. So the resurrection is kind of a metaphor for human optimism and the human spirit. But it didn't really happen, that there's still a body in the tomb. It's just a metaphor. Of course, there's a problem with that. If you're skeptic, you got a problem. The problem is something happened to galvanize a group of people 2,000 years ago, and they didn't gather, they weren't transformed by the idea that Christ has risen metaphorically. They didn't form the world's first community to include Jew, Greek, slave, free, male, female, rich, and poor, to break down every ethnic and cultural barrier based on a metaphorical resurrection. They didn't sacrifice land and property and possessions and reputation and vocations and positions based on a symbol. They didn't go to their death voluntarily by the thousands, believing that they would be resurrected metaphorically. They did it because they believed Christ is risen, and He is risen indeed. That it really happened. Listen, whether you're here as a devout believer or whether you're here today skeptical, just think about this. The earliest Christ followers understand and understood death. They knew what it looked like. They lived closer to it than we do. And this Jesus that they followed died. He was in the casket, or the tomb as it was then. And then 3 days later, the tomb was empty. Now, you might think at first that the body had been moved, and that was their first explanation too, of course. But then the strangest thing happened. This Jesus started to appear to people. First to some women who were there at the tomb, then to some of the other disciples. A little bit later, the first day, he appeared to two men who were walking down a road to a little town called Emmaus. Later on, he appeared to a disciple who was the first real doubter, a guy named Thomas. And then about 2 decades, 22, 23 years actually, after Jesus' death, the Apostle Paul wrote to some friends of his in Corinth, we didn't read that particular passage this morning, and said to them, Christ has risen, and there are 500 people who can witness to that. Now, a few of them haven't lasted 20 years. Of course, some of them died off, but he said, there's still a lot of them around. Now, you don't write something like that unless you've got witnesses who are willing to back it up. A lot of times in the Easter week, there's news magazines and articles about Jesus' death and resurrection. And sometimes they include comments by some folks who are skeptical of it, like Tom Harper and Ken Gallinger. And I've read this all, and occasionally, I just want to play with you for a minute here. Occasionally, they will say something like, well, the first record of it came 20 years, 2 decades after Jesus' death. And the implication is that, 20 years later, remember what happened. Really? Let me just do a little test. I want to give you a song. See how many people know who wrote the song. Achy Breaky Heart. Anybody know who wrote that song? Billy Ray Cyrus. Roger, that was over 20 years ago. How can you remember that? It was over 20 years ago that Billy Ray Cyrus wrote Achy Breaky Heart. And some of you could probably sing the first verse. And how important is that? Not. So let me ask you, do you think for a minute that a man or a woman who saw a resurrected Jesus 20 or 30 years ago is going to be confused about that if you can remember to the lyrics to a song that isn't even important? I'm just asking. You haven't even thought about that song in years. So when some skeptics say, well, this was all written 20 years ago, I want to say, so what? Some of us that are in our 60s, we can remember things, important things that happened in our 20s. I can remember getting married. That's 40 years ago. For those of you in the gallery, a cheap comment from my wife in the front here. So the disciples are going to forget something momentous in 20 years? I don't think so. I don't think so. As a matter of fact, one indication of how seriously they took the reality of Jesus' death is in the Gospel of Mark. We didn't read this. It's in the crucifixion story. Mark says that when Jesus buckled under the weight of the cross, a certain man of Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. Now, that's an odd little sentence in the Gospel of Mark. Why would Mark bother to give the names of the children of the man who carried Jesus' cross? Why would he do that? Well, it's because they were still alive. They were known to the audience he was writing to at that time. And Mark was saying, if you have any questions about the death and resurrection of Jesus, go ask them. Go ask them. There's only one explanation that accounts for the overnight transformation of an impoverished, confused, frightened little group of people into a courageous, emboldened community that would sacrifice everything, including their lives, to turn a world upside down. And that is, they actually believe this. That this Jesus, their teacher, their master, who they saw die on a cross, whose body they saw put in a tomb, he did what he said he would do. He is who he claimed that he was. The Lord is risen. He's risen indeed. That's the reality of the resurrection. All right. What's it mean? See, I said I had 2 funerals, and I was talking about some of this at them. Also on Wednesday, many Canadians tuned in, at least on the news, sometimes live, to see the funeral of Jim Flaherty, former Minister of Finance. And one of the compliments that many of the commentators said at the time, and I was sort of listening to this, was that Flaherty was the one who guided Canada through the worldwide financial crisis 5 years ago. And I remembered back 5 years, there was a lot of uncertainty. Can you remember? Well, you could remember Achy Breaky Heart, so you can probably remember 5 years ago. A lot of uncertainty. And I remember at the time some folks saying that their net worth had declined. Now, by net worth, we're talking about money, of course. But there's a more important sense in which the resurrection says that your human worth, your value as a person, does not fluctuate. In God's eyes, your worth never declines. 20 years ago, 10 years ago, last year, you were worth the life of his Son to God. And that's still what you're worth today. That's still what you'll be worth tomorrow. He's risen indeed, and that means money does not get to define your identity. Your job, your vocation, your title, your position, how things are going up or down, does not get to say what you are worth. Listen, you can walk out of here today with your head held high, because to the God who created everything, to the God who created the universe, you are worth more than every dollar and drachma and ruby and ruble and pound and mark and yen ever printed. You are worth the life of God's Son, and he died on a cross, and he was resurrected, and he's risen indeed. Second thing the resurrection means is that your future is not up for grabs. No matter what happens, your future is not up for grabs. One of my favorite historical characters is Winston Churchill. And Churchill, one of his great characteristics is that he was tenacious. When the war was over, he had to give a commencement. And his commencement was 9 words: never give up, never give up, never give up. That's tenacity, real tenacity. He had a famous running battle with a lady named Lady Astor. She would insult him, and he always had a comeback for her. One time she said to him, "Mr. Churchill, if you were my husband, I'd put arsenic in your tea." His response was, "Lady Astor, if you were my wife, I'd drink it." He was a tough guy, Churchill. But even Winston Churchill could not defeat death. When he was an old man, he did die. He had planned his funeral ahead of time, and at the end of it, after every word had been spoken, after the benediction, before the people left, Churchill had put a bugler high up in the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, that beautiful church in London, England, and the bugler began to play taps, the universal signal that day is done, the night has come, and there was silence, and everybody in the vast audience at the funeral thought about this great life and how it was now done. But then after the silence, there was one more song. You see, Churchill had arranged for another bugler high up on the other side of the dome. And that bugler began to play Reveille, the time to get up, the song of the new day. Why did he do that? because one day the greatest man who ever lived said, I am the resurrection and the life. Now, Churchill was a remarkable guy, but he never said, I am the resurrection and the life. Only Jesus said that. Will your future have problems? Of course. Of course it will. There's a pretty good chance you'll die. Every once in a while, I'm driving over here to Fairview Cemetery with one of the local funeral directors. I'm not going to name him. And I'll say, you busy these days? He says, John, mortality rate is still 100%. Does that make Jesus nervous? Not at all. Why not? He's already died. He's already taken on himself the worst that death can do. And he has risen indeed. The reality of the resurrection. So who do I call when life starts to tumble in? When a marriage falls apart, or I mess up as a parent, or damage my child in significant ways, or violate my own norms, or get so angry that I'm embarrassed about it later, or get trapped in deceit, or get greedy and destroy a business, or hooked on an addiction that ends in humiliation, or I'm afraid to say something or do something that I know needs to be said and just feel ashamed about it, I call Jesus. You see, the Apostle Paul said, at just the right time, when we were powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. That's you and me. But God demonstrates his love, Paul says, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us, from Romans. Some of you need to hear this. The resurrection for you means the best is yet to come. Wherever you have traveled, however old you are, you haven't seen the best yet. If we are a resurrection people, the best is still to come. Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever lives by believing in me, by coming to me, by following me, by trusting in me, by putting their life in my hands, I'll be there. Well, how do you get to be part of that? How do you get to be part of God's resurrection plan? Rick Warren, a pastor from California, put it this way. He said there's two ways to be part of the resurrection life. One is to be perfect. God is perfect. Life with God will be perfect. No more violence, no more injustice, no more unspeakable things happening to little girls there, no more greed, no more deceit, no more arrogance, no more deception. It'll be filled with perfect people. One plan to spend life eternally with God is be perfect. How are you doing with that one? Not so well. Well, we need another plan. Now, some people have some misinformation about this. Some people are trying the good enough plan when it comes to God. I believe there's a God. I believe there's life after death. And if I'm just good enough, that'll be good enough. If I go to church enough, or if I give to charity enough, or if I volunteer enough, if I just believe enough, if I do enough good things, more than bad things, I'll be good enough. Problem is, God is not a good enough God. He's a perfect God. And heaven is a perfect place. So the good enough plan isn't a good enough plan, if I can put it that way. Other people try the comparison plan. Ideas here, I think God's going to judge on the curve. Passing grade, I'll just be a few points above the curve. So you're hoping on Judgment Day, you're standing behind Osama bin Laden so that it doesn't look that bad, but you end up behind Mother Teresa. And God says to Mother Teresa, I'm sorry, you just weren't good enough to make the cut. She's already said that himself. I'm just quoting her. So God came up with another way. It's called the grace plan. I can't live a perfect life. I'm almost 62. That was shot years ago. I can't. It's too late for me to be perfect. But Jesus, he did. He lived the perfect life. And so when he went to the cross, he covered my moral debt. So being loved, being forgiven, being renewed, that's a gift from God. That's part of what the resurrection means. There's this bloodstained cross, there's an empty tomb, and there's a rolled away stone. And there's a risen Savior, and God's done it all. And in Jesus, God says, I will be your guide. I will be your strength. I will be your leader. I will be your Savior. The thing is, if you've never said yes to that, to Him, Easter's as good a time as any. Better time, really, to do it. Maybe you drifted away. I don't care how far you've drifted away. You can't drift far enough that God cannot reach you in Jesus. He's reached people a lot further than you or me. Maybe you come from a different religious background. It's not about religion. It's about a relationship with Him. About saying yes. And you can let go of any fear or confusion or pride or sin, whatever it is that keeps from God. It's just this simple. We say, God, I want to commit myself to you. I want to receive your gift. I don't want to try the performance plan or the good enough plan or the comparison plan. I want your gift of grace. Then it's not just Easter on the calendar. Then it's Easter in your heart.